Okay, you guys have been waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting, but don't worry, it's finally happening. I'm going to be covering and oversimplifying the Xbox Series X specs and giving it a proper dissecting on this channel, all while comparing it to the PS5 and giving my 2 cents. As the title suggests, I'm currently enrolled in University for Computer Engineering and I have a bit of a deeper understanding of what all this stuff means, so here's my attempt to spread the knowledge. And I've gotta say, I'm pretty impressed with what Microsoft has on their hands here, but just as a warning, I will not be talking about the CPUs or GPUs in either console in this video. Those topics have already been beaten to death all over YouTube, and quite frankly, I'm tired of talking about them. I want this video to be about explaining some of the things that nobody really wants to explain, like velocity architecture, Sony's SSD, Project Acoustics, the TEMPEST, mesh shaders, primitive shaders, backwards compatibility, and pretty much all the terms that people throw around in arguments but actually have no clue what they mean. If you want a CPU versus GPU comparison, though I haven't explicitly titled any of my videos that, I do talk about it pretty extensively on my channel, so feel free to pick your poison. But without further ado, let's jump straight into it. The Xbox Series X oversimplified and compared to the PS5 in under, let's say, 19 minutes. Now on to backwards compatibility. If you're a fan of the Xbox brand, you'll be happy to know that Microsoft has promised thousands of your favorite games across the original Xbox, Xbox 360, and Xbox One will work on your Xbox SX. This is mainly possible due to the similar design philosophies across multiple generations that will allow for easy ports over to the Xbox SX. While every single game will not be available to play, Microsoft says to expect a vast library of backwards compatible games, including all of your favorites, which is a very neat feature for those of you interested in keeping all your old games. So, how does this stack up against the PS5? Well, pretty damn well. Sony has stated that the PS5 will only support backwards compatibility for PS4 titles, meaning that PS3, PS2, or PS1 games will not be playable on your PS5, and the PS5 will only support the top 100 PS4 titles ranked by playtime at launch. Sony says that this is mainly due to the vastly different architecture of the PS5 when compared to the older systems, and that incorporating dedicated hardware to play these games would not be very cost effective and would actually hinder the performance of the new hardware in the PS5. Do with that information what you will. Sony has confirmed, however, that in due time over 4,000 PS4 games should be expected to make their way onto PS5. So, final verdict? I think this is a very clear victory in Microsoft's favor, though I will say it is a bit concerning that the Xbox SX will be able to support games all the way back to the original Xbox. Because that kind of indicates one of three things: either a supreme level of forward thinking back in 2001 when the original Xbox released, highly skilled technicians at Microsoft who were able to work some genie magic on the Xbox Series X firmware and hardware, or in my opinion, and the most likely option, an indication of sustained core design philosophy and architecture across almost 2 decades of gaming. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Heck, Microsoft is even very proud in admitting that fact, and I even mentioned so at the beginning of the video, and there are a lot of benefits to be had by doing this. But in my opinion, I don't particularly see the use of potentially holding back your console just so that it could play old games. It's kind of like Sony and Microsoft took 2 completely different routes in terms of backwards compatibility. Microsoft made sure the hardware in the Xbox Series X would work with old games, while Sony didn't care less about implementing it as a feature and instead opted to make old games work with the PS5. Both philosophies have their pros and cons, and though I do lean towards the direction that Sony chose because, let's face it, I like seeing new cool ways of configuring tech, I will admit that it is pretty damn sweet that I could play the original Halo in 4K if I wanted to. Either way, bravo to Microsoft, all those extra games will definitely be a nice bonus feature to have. But now, onto what most of you guys probably clicked on this video for, the Xbox Velocity architecture. The Xbox Velocity architecture consists of 4 main components that I will now explain to you. Let's start off with the first of the 4, Microsoft's DirectStorage. DirectStorage is a part of the DirectX 12 Ultimate API. You might have heard of the term DirectX 12 because it's what Windows and most PCs use to run their games or any specific program that calls for an API. DirectX is the Windows API and the staple API in PC gaming, and recently Microsoft have brought in all the benefits of this API to the entirety of the Xbox brand and aim to take it up a level with the release of DirectX 12 Ultimate on the Xbox Series X later this year. And you might be wondering, What the hell is an API? Well, API stands for Application Programming Interface and is basically the glue, the middleman, or the communication line between instruction sets and the hardware that needs to execute them. Meaning, whatever instruction sets coded by a game developer doesn't just go straight into your graphics card to be rendered, they need to essentially be translated by an API first so that the graphics card knows exactly what it's doing. For example, let's say a developer wrote down some pseudocode that went like this. Using light reflections, which will enable our animation to reflect light, create sphere, which will create a sphere, sphere.size equals 5, which will set the size of our sphere to 5 arbitrary units, sphere.rotation equals true, which will make our sphere rotate indefinitely, and finally, sphere.texture equals earth.jpg, which will set the texture of our sphere to the file image we have named earth on our computer. And when your graphics card looks at all this code, it has absolutely no clue what to do with it, because your graphics card can't read like humans, and the only thing that this code is doing is essentially producing pointless letters that cannot be directly processed by your card. Enter your API, the middleman, and what the API does is essentially take all of the code written by the developers, and by using its own set of logic and rules, translates it into a language that your graphics card could understand and render before translating it back and displaying it on your screen, and then boom, all of a sudden, you get a rotating earth sphere that reflects light. An API is quite literally just a middleman that defines all of the rules of the scope. And now that you know what it is, we can go back to DirectStorage, which is just a part of the DirectX 12 Ultimate API and specifically handles how the CPU deals with assets loading in behind the scene. The DirectStorage API aims to offload some of the computational strain brought by asset loading away from the CPU and onto other components like the SSD and specifically its dedicated decompression chip, which also happens to be the second and third part of the Xbox Velocity architecture, the SSD and its dedicated decompression chip. Let's explain the SSD first. So, stepping it up from the previous generation, Microsoft has decided to opt for solid state drive or SSD storage instead of HD hard drive storage, and this pretty much has two main benefits. Number one, the drive will be more reliable and less likely to fail, and number two, the drive will be significantly faster. The exact speed of the drive has actually been confirmed by Microsoft to be 2.4 gigabytes per second of raw data and 4.8 gigabytes per second of compressed data. And what that means is that the SSD is capable of outputting 2.4 gigabytes per second of data that the DirectX API could directly work with, and 4.8 gigabytes per second of data that must be uncompressed before the API can use it. A good comparison would be sending written directions on a piece of paper. If you simply send that piece of paper to the API without altering it, it will be able to read and execute the directions as soon as they're received. But sending that entire piece of paper takes up a lot of real estate. So what if we could make it smaller so that we could send more directions at once without going over that same real estate budget? Well, I just described the process of compression to you. If you so choose, you could actually expend some CPU processing power to compress the piece of paper, i.e. crumple it up, and make some space for another piece of crumpled directions that you could then send to the API. And once it gets there, the API won't be able to read your crumpled pieces of compressed data, so it needs to be decompressed or uncrumpled. And this is where we kind of run into a problem. CPUs are pretty good at compressing things, but it's common knowledge that they suck at decompressing things. Which actually brings us to the third part of the Xbox Velocity architecture, the custom decompression chip, which does exactly what it sounds like. It decompresses data so that it becomes legible to whatever piece of hardware or API needs to access it without putting a strain on the CPU by making it have to do the decompression itself. And you could kind of see how the entirety of the Xbox Velocity architecture is starting to take shape. You have the DirectStorage API, which acts as the moderator and the communication line between the CPU, storage devices, and video game, the SSD, which acts as the new superfast medium in which data could be sent and compressed, and the dedicated decompression chip, which with the help of DirectStorage will aim to eliminate as much CPU strain caused by data transmission as possible. Pretty cool. But now we only have to cover the fourth and final piece of the Velocity architecture, something called Sampler Feedback Streaming, or SFS for short. And SFS is described by Microsoft as a feature of the Xbox hardware that allows games to load into memory only the portions of textures that the GPU needs for any particular scene as it needs them, which will essentially free up a significant amount of RAM to be used elsewhere in the system, since textures that aren't being used won't be cluttering it up thanks to SFS, which I think for the most part is pretty straightforward, but if you have any questions, just feel free to ask down below. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the entirety of the Xbox Velocity architecture. Putting it all together, it's a rather impressive configuration, and Microsoft claims that Velocity will give the Xbox access to 100 gigabytes of data instantaneously, a number that I'm sure you must have heard floating around by now. And I'm not going to lie, I have no clue what they mean by that. And the entirety of the internet who actually cares enough to try to understand this stuff doesn't seem to know either. Because when they say access to 100 gigabytes of data, do they mean game assets? Do they mean streamed at once, picked from within, 100 gigabytes per second of data transfer, or possibly something else? Nobody really knows, and the best guesses we could come up with so far are by a bunch of people on the Xbox Series X subreddit putting on their tinfoil hats. And right now, everyone seems to be leaning towards 100 gigabytes of game assets that will be instantly accessible if 1. They are picked from within the 100 gigabytes of pre-allocated data, and 2. Are picked and streamed one at a time, or at least in similar groupings as opposed to simultaneously, which I also think is most likely what they meant. So as much as I want to, I can't 100% explain that part to you because Microsoft just haven't fully explained it themselves yet. But everything else, I hope I did a decent job. So now the obvious question is, how does the entirety of the Xbox Velocity architecture compare to the PS5, its custom SSD, and Kraken? Well, long story short, after extensively reading up on both of these consoles and attempting to get as technical of an idea of the hardware as I can, I'm convinced that this section is a pretty easy win by Sony. And before you start calling me a sellout in the comments, I am very impressed with what Xbox Velocity managed to do with the limited amount of customization they had to work with, likely due in part to keeping as many games as backwards compatible as possible. But the custom SSD on the PS5, which are oversimplifying the video showing up on the top right of your screen, is honestly just unmatched, both in speed and the mitigation of bottlenecks, which I don't even think Xbox Velocity bothered to take into account. So without getting into too much detail, let me just throw up some numbers that help illustrate my point. Remember when I said that the custom SSD in the Xbox will be able to manage 2.4 gigabytes per second raw and 4.8 gigabytes per second compressed? Well, the SSD on the PS5 will be able to manage 5.5 gigabytes per second raw and 9 gigabytes per second compressed, as well as fully saturate that transfer rate due to a lot of crazy engineering Sony detailed in their Road to PS5 video. So while Sony will be able to take full advantage of those 5.5 and 9 gigabytes per second transfer rates respectively, it's unlikely that the rates on Xbox will be able to saturate those theoretical maximums of 2.4 and 4.8 gigabytes per second, even with the help of Velocity architecture. And not to mention that when using their custom Kraken decompressor chip, Sony actually claims that the SSD may be able to achieve compressed transfer rates of 22 gigabytes per second if the data was coded to compress as efficiently as possible. So like I said earlier, this one has to go to Sony. But now onto the next part of the Xbox specs, and arguably the most misunderstood: mesh shaders. So what are mesh shaders anyways? Well, let's first define shaders before we get into meshes. Shaders are basically the parts of a 3D model that you can add effects to without necessarily changing the original model itself. When modifying a shader, you can change not only the lighting for a specific area of a 3D model, but also the texture, the relative position, the opacity, the reflectivity, or whatever it may be. Shaders are actually much more versatile than the word leads you to believe. For example, a vertex shader, which is one of the most common used shaders in video games today. It's used to modify all aspects of vertices within 3D models, and vertices are just points where the polygons that make up a 3D model intersect. So technically, using a vertex shader, not only could you change the lighting and reflectivity of a specific object, but you could also vary the position of each individual vertex, like shown in this bloated soldier here. Both of these images have the same 3D models, but one has just been changed dramatically by the capabilities of vertex shaders. And that's what shaders are. Think of them as the last stage of final detail in a 3D model that can modify all sorts of things, not just lighting and texture. The cherry on top, if you will. So now mesh shaders, what are they? Well, in a nutshell, their main goal isn't to increase game world detail, though I'm sure they could probably do that, but instead to increase and stabilize performance by choosing to shade meshlets or a small collection of vertices at once, instead of doing each and every one individually. They can also employ a pretty sneaky yet powerful tactic that essentially makes it so that meshlets that can't be seen directly by the player will be de-rendered, which will increase GPU overhead and performance. So, now that you know what mesh shaders are, how does that stack up to the PS5? Well, here's where that becomes a pretty tricky question to answer for two main reasons. Reason number one, as detailed by Mark Cerny, the PS5's main focus seems to be on primitive shaders, which are shaders that can essentially synthesize new geometry on the fly, even while being rendered. This will allow for two main techniques: smoothly varying levels of detail, which will optimize performance by giving detail to things that need it while taking it away from things that don't, and also additional procedural generation, which will allow for things like particle effects and detailed textures to only be generated as you move closer to an object to be able to see them, kinda like real life. So while primitive shaders and mesh shaders are similar in some ways, they're kind of hard to compare. They take two completely different approaches to how shaders should be used. In my opinion, mesh shaders focus on maximizing performance, while primitive shaders focus on maximizing detail, if your system could handle it, of course. And now, reason number 2 as to why it's tricky to see which console is better at shading is because neither of these technologies is proprietary to Sony or Microsoft. Yes, you heard me right. When I made my last video detailing Sony's SSD and how bonkers it is, I made a statement that the PS5 will be able to do some shading techniques that the Xbox Series X and quote, just cannot do. And I still stand by that. Because while Microsoft seems to be claiming mesh shaders as their go-to shading technique and Sony seems to be claiming primitive shaders, there's nothing stopping developers from both consoles from using either or, because both consoles have the same graphics architecture after all. Yes, you heard it here first, folks. Sony can use mesh shaders and Microsoft can use primitive shaders. They are not proprietary. You can, however, make the argument that one console can do one better than the other, but not that one console can't do the other. So it was kind of embarrassing when I had like 50 people in my comment section swearing that mesh shaders will make, and quote, the Xbox's SSD match if not beat Sony's SSD. What? So now you could kind of see why I think that's the most ridiculous claim ever. It's just wrong. Because a simple runtime or program like shaders will not make up for the significant difference between Sony's SSD and Microsoft's. And what happens when we do mesh versus mesh on both consoles? Does Microsoft still catch up? Yeah, it just doesn't make sense. So who wins? Again, I think this is a clean sweep by Sony because shading techniques are just too heavily dependent on asset loading and Sony's SSD is actually inhumane. So while Xbox can attempt to do some asset streaming in the same way the PS5 does, it will have to cheat and use much more RAM and processing power in the process to make up for its slower storage drive. And games that use the full capabilities of Sony's SSD and completely saturate its maximum throughput, like exclusives for example, as I said in my video, simply will not be possible on the Xbox unless a port was created that the Xbox's drive can handle. So shaders, this is a win for Sony, but now on to ray tracing. Without getting into too much detail, DirectX Ray Tracing aims to bring photorealistic lighting and shadows to Xbox later this year. If you want an example of how this might look, I'm going to throw up some images of how Minecraft looks when ray traced, since everybody seemed to like the last example that I gave in my last video. As you can see, it's a pretty impressive technology, and quite frankly astonishing that Microsoft managed to get this feature on the Xbox, being that it's only been available on PC for less than 2 years and is still quite expensive to get into. How it works is that it basically overrides traditional illumination techniques and instead simulates the actual behavior of light to illuminate the in-game world, and the end product is what you saw in those Minecraft images. You can kind of think of ray tracing as the ultimate shader technique that only controls illumination and shadows. So which is better, PS5 or Xbox? I think hands down this one has to go to Xbox. Ray tracing is very processor and graphics intensive and doesn't really worry too much about loading assets in, since everything that you need like shadows or refractivity is being simulated on the spot, so the PS5's SSD simply won't be too helpful in this scenario. The power of the Xbox makes it a clear victor here, since it has more headroom to be able to make this ray tracing stuff work, so I think you could expect either higher frame rates or better ray trace worlds on Xbox by the very nature of how ray tracing works. So this goes to Xbox. But now, on to the final part of today's video. Which system has the better audio? So for those of you guys who might not know, Xbox actually has its own audio system called Project Acoustics to combat Sony's TEMPEST audio technology. Now, not enough is known about how either of these technologies will perform in real-world applications, but we can take a look at the difference in philosophies and how they're implementing said philosophies to make a guess as to which will be better. And to start off, Microsoft's Project Acoustics is based on Project TRITON, a 3D audio system initially developed for VR and focuses mainly on attempting to simulate sound waves and how they travel, kind of like ray tracing but for audio. However, it's just a runtime with a bunch of parameters, meaning that it's simply a program that will need to be processed by Xbox's processor. Sony's TEMPEST Audio, however, has its own dedicated chip within the PS5, capable of processing audio information that would, and quote, saturate all 8 cores of the PS4's processor today. And its philosophy differs a bit too. With Tempest, Sony aims to recreate sound by dramatically increasing the number of possible directions your headphones can recreate sound from, with the goal of having as many of these directions available as possible to accurately simulate simulate how sound would behave in real life. They also aim to have every player measure and record their head-related transfer functions, or HRTFs, a term that I explained in the latter half of my PS5 spec breakdown video if you want to check it out, so that every single sound generated will be tailored to that specific player's ears alone and will sound lifelike to that player and that player only. Simply put, every player has different head and ear shapes, and Sony aims to implement their HRTFs into their TEMPEST 3D audio system, as well as add as many sound sources as possible to make sounds as lifelike as they can be to whatever player the system is calibrated to. So with that out of the way, who wins? I think this is a clear win for Sony for two main reasons. Number one, on my last video, I had a viewer mention that what Sony is doing with Tempest isn't impressive since Microsoft could just implement the sound customizability of HRTFs onto Xbox's code, since HRTFs aren't a proprietary metric. And he would be 100% correct if it weren't for the fact that HRTFs are pretty complex things to process, since they must be represented in the frequency domain and transformed back into the time domain in order to be processed by whatever processor wants to emulate the sound tailored to your ears. And if you don't know what a frequency or time domain is, Jesus Christ, just don't worry about it. Just know that I've seen many brave men fall and other grown adults cry when they have to understand this stuff and attempt to do it by hand. That is how complicated they are, and they are a pain in the ass to engineers. But for you to get an idea of how annoying they are, however, here's a couple of parts from the Fourier transform theorem with no context. I'll even throw a Laplace transform in there, which is more useful with electricity than it is with sound, but screw it, here you go. To continue, to be able to fully utilize these HRTFs, you need to be able to do hundreds of these Fourier and reverse Fourier transforms a second, which would consume a substantial amount of processing power, which, according to Sony, is all the processing power your PS4 could output right now. But lucky for Sony, remember when I said that they implemented a dedicated sound chip? That sound processor will be able to deal with all of this math without infringing on the performance of any other parts. Microsoft just simply doesn't have a dedicated sound processor. Project Acoustics is a custom sound engine, while the Tempest is customized hardware along with a customized sound engine. And this leads us into reason number two as to why the PS5 will have better audio. The methods employed by Sony simply cannot be replicated on the Xbox, as if they tried to, they would take a noticeable hit to performance, due to the lack of that dedicated sound processor. All of this just goes to show that Sony's Tempest should outperform Microsoft's Project Acoustics, especially since Raytracing for sound should be more intensive than Raytracing for light, if done 100% faithfully, but with diminishing returns the more and more detailed you go. But with the Tempest, the only barrier is measuring your own ears. Anyways lads, that's gonna bring us to the end of the video. As of recording this, I obviously haven't started editing yet, but I can tell you that it's gonna be at least like 25 hours if I move fast. So while I normally don't ask this, make sure to destroy that like button if you enjoyed, and also to drop a sub if you're somewhat interested in seeing more gaming content from me. Well, I'm not gonna make this outro any longer than it has to be. I've been Innocence, you've been the audience, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Yeah, peace out.